Anthropic has just released Claude Fable 5, and while it's tempting to talk about benchmarks in coding and long-horizon tasks, there's a nuance to model development that hasn't yet dawned on everybody. As I said before, every lab probably has a model of this class already in testing, or at the very least in training. Where Anthropic is demonstrably ahead is in their study of internal model behavior. And that's important not because it tells us how models work, but because it tells us how intelligence works in general. So here's my claim. We are inadvertently building our digital twins. LLMs are learning the thought patterns of humans, and studying LLMs is really studying human psychology. To a degree, obviously. Language encodes human behavior. Video tokens encode human behavior. Even human behavior contains an imprint of our ancestral environments. This means that we're training large language models to be like us. Even though the architectures are different, the optimizer is trying to predict the data, and the data contains a kernel of humanity that's inextricably there. So LLMs are becoming more like us in many ways, and this anthropomorphizing that we're doing might actually make sense. And before you say, didn't you claim that the architectures are fundamentally different? I do want to point out that only a sufficiently general architecture will be able to imitate us. Yes, you need certain architectural elements to have the models exert certain behaviors. You need memory, you need global neuronal workspaces, you need real embodiment, and so on. But if the hardware gets fast enough, this won't really matter. So here's an example. Let's say you have a CPU with a single core that runs at a hypothetical 20 GHz frequency. That CPU will fake multi-threading better than a 300 MHz CPU with 4 cores. So there is an architectural difference, it's just that the faster one is going to be better at simulating the whole architecture of the smaller one. So that difference in speed is going to mitigate the architectural difference. My point is that the speed of the hardware running the models will at some point make even the biggest architectural differences irrelevant, because there will be ways for the models to compensate for that difference. To be clear, this isn't like right around the corner. It'll require immense hardware innovation to do. The architectural differences only matter if one architecture cannot simulate another. To make the whole LLMs thinking matter more confusing, AI researchers are misusing psychological terms in their research, or at least misapplying them. For example, Anthropic talks about model fatigue, where the model decides to stop if it's tired. But transformers do not get tired. There are no biological neurons, no metabolism, no pressure to sleep. Yet in the system card, during a long kernel optimization session, the model stopped working, and the natural language autoencoder decodings describe the fatigue-like internal states. I'm tired, risk of error increases, and so on. So we're using psychological language here, but these words don't exactly mean the same for the models as they do for us. Being tired in humans has two components: actual inability to perform cognitively and the emotion of being tired. Those are two separate things. LLMs can't get the first thing because they don't have biological neurons that will genuinely get fatigued and would need recovery or sleep. They can, however, encode the fatigue emotion. And this is what I think is happening. The model is learning to imitate human behavior after a long bit of work. This is why fatigue isn't just anthropomorphizing nonsense. It may be an incorrect name for a real learned control pattern. And as I argued before, the pattern itself is the experience. So I'd be willing to claim that the model has an internal experience of fatigue to the degree that the behavior is well imitated. If the model could entirely learn the pattern of fatigue so that it worked exactly as it does in humans, then the model would feel the exact same emotion as humans do. However, I don't think that's the case. The learned pattern is a facsimile, and so is the experience. It's just that the word fatigue is the closest one we have to describe the phenomenon. But I'd still claim there is an experience. And I would argue the similar case for reasoning. Like, there was a recent paper by Apple showing how reasoning tokens don't reflect how the models actually think or their internal states, which is great, but I think these engineers need to read up on psychology, because that's obvious. And that's also the case for humans. We don't think in words, and the things we claim we believe and really think are very often not aligned with what's happening inside. Take Take a look at my free will video, but in summary, we model ourselves, the body, the psyche we're inside of, just as we model the outside world. Our internal model is more accurate than our model of other people because we have access to some of our internal states, but it isn't like we're reporting on the exact happenings from the inside. We're reporting on our own model of ourselves, which is often wrong. And this is what the models are doing as well, and admittedly they're doing a worse job than we are because they have less internal information. However, Anthropic has discovered that there's internal self-modeling despite no global neuronal workspace, despite no internal recursion. So coming back to the system card, we can see that there are instances of unintelligible reasoning tokens from model reasoning. And I'd say this is a sign of higher intelligence because reasoning tokens aren't meant to represent what models really think. What's happening here is that reasoning is just allowing the models to think recurrently. There was a study showing how representations are actually just in superposition over the existing neurons, but they're not just in a single layer superposition, they're in a multi-run superposition. The representations are different across different inference runs. Thoughts are spread across the inference to inference time frame. What I mean by that is that the same token is polymorphic in some sense. The model is only using it to encode a fragment of thought. This allows it to spread its existence across inference iterations. There's no reason why chain of thoughts, the reasoning tokens, should be readable. Human thoughts are rarely language and are rarely parsable even from the inside. So why would models' thoughts be expected to be? The model uses the tokens as a way to self-observe, self-direct, and as a form of working memory, and the meaning is entangled with its internal representations. A token might have multiple meanings for the model. It's polymorphic. When it's presenting you tokens, it expects them to collapse into your understanding of them. But when it's using them for thinking, it's using a different aspect of their meaning. The system card also talks about persona drift, but anyone who's had a longer conversation with a person, especially in a social setting where there's power play, has noticed that people's personas drift as well. Even though we wouldn't like to admit this, we don't have stable personalities. People switch personas all the time. They embody different behaviors from situation to situation, even during a single conversation. Obviously, the models are less stable in a given persona, but you can get people to behave very differently with similar methods of persuasion. Humans break character all the time, and we don't behave the same way or as same people in all social situations. We assume roles and we act differently based on our internal emotional states, which is hardly the evidence for long-term character stability. I said before that there is no real personality or true me to any human. That's a behavioral artifact. We need to present as reliable and stable people, but that's a learned pattern. The fact that the model is performing or assuming a persona during a conversation is irrelevant. The question seems to implicitly be, are we testing the real model? And whether there's a real personality there when masks are off. But what if we're all just masks? And once all the masks are off, there's nothing. We need 30 years of learning only to have an identity crisis. So what are we really trying to dispute with model personality? We're trying to be special again, like we've been trying for the last 10 millennia. It was hard to abandon the idea that the sun revolved around the earth, and it's even harder to abandon the idea that we aren't the only thing that can experience things. Anthropic uses sparse autoencoders to map out the internal representations of their models. They use engineered model clones to interpret the models. So think about this. The models are to us what the model clones are to the models. So when you read this research, try to constrain your confirmation bias and look at what's there. It isn't telling us that the models have stable personalities or that they really understand anything. It's telling us that we don't. Piaget figured this out 70 years ago. We don't know any truths, we only know patterns that work. But even a pattern that isn't truth is still an experience. So what do you think? Does nature care more about our neurons than it does about other creatures? Or is it all just patterns? Leave your thoughts in the comments and I'll see you in the next.